without any further ado, I'm just going to do a quick introduction to Mohsin, who is, as most of you know, your EVPS, External Vice President and Statewide Affairs, there we go, the rest of it, of Associated Students. He's a Black Studies and Sociology double major, and was also involved in a lot of different organizing on campus, involvement in this Million Student March, really amazing things. Without further ado, I'll let him finish introducing himself. Please give it up for Mohsin.
Good morning, everyone. My name is, thanks for the introduction, Emily, and for everyone for allowing me to have this opportunity to speak. I really do appreciate it, to the folks that organized this. My name is Mohsin Mirza. I'm the current External Vice President of Statewide Affairs on this campus. I'm also the undergraduate chair of the UC Student Association, which I've served on the board for 2 years. I've been involved on campus with lobbying in Sacramento, as well as organizing here on campus. Before I begin, I want to say that a lot of the effort to put this presentation together has been pulled through from different folks who've organized the Million Student March previously. And we had a teach-in a few weeks before that march where a lot of the content from this was brought forward for the first time, and I want to make sure that we're giving credit to those folks and other folks who organized the march. There were folks in my office, folks in the United States Student Association, UCSB for Bernie, as well as a lot of other dedicated, hardworking organizers who put in a lot of time and effort to make it so that we could push this conversation as far as we're pushing it. So what I want to begin talking about is the university that we're at right now. Let's think about the quality of education we receive. Can I get a show of hands real quick? Who here has tried to crash a class and has been unable to do so, even though it's a class that you need? Quick show of hands. Most hands are going up. How many folks here have sat on the floor in a lecture for a long time because our classrooms are overcrowded and there's not enough professors and teachers and TAs to give quality instruction to our students? Let's see another show of hands. Again, it's everyone. And we're seeing this. So even if, let's say you're a wealthy student, that you don't care about social justice or any of these things, the quality of this university has been directly impacted by decisions made by politicians and by the system itself over the past 20 years. And we feel that impact every day on our campus, in our classrooms that are breaking down, in our lecture halls, which are bigger than ever. Do you know how big the student to faculty ratio here at UCSB is? It's about 1 to 17. That's something that our administration is very proud of. Do you know what the faculty ratio to student is at Stanford? It's actually 1 to 4. And that direct instruction has a big impact on the quality of education people receive. Now let's think about affordability. Now, this one for sure we know is a serious problem. Let's get a show of hands if you or a friend of yours has ever considered leaving this university not because they couldn't, handle the rigor of the courses, but because they've had serious questions over whether or not they could afford it, or whether or not they wanted to put that kind of burden on the families they've been part of. Let's see a quick show of hands. Nearly everyone is raising their hands. We all know this is a very serious problem. So around a decade and a half ago, tuition was around $3,000 a year. Now today, tuition stands at 3 times that, at $12,000 a year. And we all know that those are only a fraction of the cost we pay. Between housing costs, which rise every year, the cost of textbooks, which textbook companies are making millions off of, we're seeing the total cost of education in the upwards of $40,000 for a student. And even with financial aid, the average student's graduating with a debt of over $20,000. For those fortunate not to be graduating with debt, they are forced to work many, many hours, and they're really part-time students, full-time workers, just to afford to be here. But that's for the people who are here at the university. For a lot of those people, those are the folks who've already made it. Because if you look at who gets to go to a university, we have a very serious problem in this country. Everyone who came here had to take either the SAT or the ACT. I remember taking the SAT. I got the score that I worked to get and all of that stuff. But if you look at charts like this, what we realize is the very metric with which we use to compare students to one another is entirely skewed by class. The average SAT score of a person whose family makes between $20,000 and $40,000 is about 1,400. More than 200,000, it's in 1,700. You know how much you have to get into UC nowadays is upwards of 1,800, 1,900. So we're seeing, just from the very class that you're born into, your ability to access a university is in serious doubt. And all of this is skewed across racial lines as well. A couple years ago, there was a study by the US Department of Education that surveyed every single high school, middle school, and elementary school in this country. And the results they found were very shocking. A lot of us know about the school-to-prison pipeline. Black students are 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled than white students, oftentimes for the very same offenses. And this has dramatic impacts for them later on in life, as school suspensions lead to school dropouts, which leads to time in prison and things along those lines. But it goes deeper than that. A quarter of all high schools with the highest percentage of Black and Latino students do not offer any Algebra 2 courses, while a third of those schools do not have any chemistry courses. Algebra 2 is on the SAT. How are you going to study calculus in college if you haven't taken Algebra 2? How are you expected to fulfill your dreams and be a doctor if the school you go to does not even offer chemistry in high school? Black students are 4 times as likely as white students, and Latino students are 2 times as likely to attend schools where 1 out of every 5 teachers does not meet all the state teaching education requirements. You put that in conjunction with the fact that a lot of these schools in lower income neighborhoods do not have shiny new laptops or even new textbooks, but have larger classrooms with less one-on-one instruction. It really begs into question, all of this together, how the UC and universities across this country are failing to meet their mission. The UC was founded on this principle, to be quality, affordable, and accessible. And this comes back to the California Master Plan. The way in which our education system was organized today comes back to this master plan. That's what created the 3-tier system of community colleges, state colleges, and the UC. And part of that master plan, what many folks forget, was that the UC was designed and was intended to be tuition-free for all residents of the state. And it was indeed tuition-free for several years. Then we have, in the 1960s, around 68, Governor Reagan at the time was not a fan of students. When he ran for governor, he ran against the University of California. It was his favorite thing to pick on, saying this. He saw universities less as learning centers and more as like these kind of communist factories that were all up to no good and all that. And because of this, he saw free higher education as part of that. And not because the state could not afford to have free higher education, but because he didn't want it to, he helped institute the first student fees. And they had to be called student fees because at the time tuition was against the legal policies of the state of California. And he succeeded in that, and he succeeded in screwing a lot of things up for the next 20-odd years that he was with us. Reagan's influence went far-reaching. It affected things like Prop 13, tax revolts, which had dramatic impacts on what we could afford in this state. You know, Prop 13 allows corporations like Disneyland to hide a lot of corporate taxes. Around $9 billion a year is saved from corporations which hold on to the same land, whereas family income taxes, property taxes are much higher than that. It affects, and when you lose state revenue, you lose state services. But beyond that, there are a lot more issues that impact the affordability, the quality, and the accessibility of our education. And one of them you may not realize is the prison industrial complex. So let's say you have a random student, we're gonna name him Stephen. And Stephen grew up in a middle-class home, he's white, no one in his family has ever been to prison, he went to a good high school, and all of that. But in 1971, something happened dramatically that affected his life. The war on drugs was launched, oftentimes to privately, folks in the Nixon administration admitted that a key reason for this was to undermine leftist social movements, anti-war movements, black radical movements. It had a massive impact on who goes to prison. Today, 1 in 111 white women will go to prison in their lifetime. 1 in 45 Latina women. 1 in 18 black women, 1 in 17 white men, 1 in 6 Latino men, and 1 in 3 black men will go to prison in a lifetime. The most shocking statistic of all. Many of us have seen these numbers, and many of us know that this is not a direct relation to crime rates themselves. Black youth commit drug crimes at slightly lower rates than their white counterparts, get arrested at 10 times the rate. And what we've seen is this massive explosion in making things that we used to treat as public health problems, like drug use, into criminal problems. An increase of 800% in the number of people who are incarcerated for nonviolent drug offenses, and today around half of those incarcerated are for that reason. But we also should acknowledge that even folks who commit quote-unquote violent crimes, their sentences have been lengthened, and the number of people who go to prison just as a whole has completely ballooned as a result of harsher sentencing and the tough on crime attitudes. Now, why does this impact Stephen? Going back to what we were talking about. Well, because back in 1967, when the UC was a free institution, the state spent around 8% of its budget on the university and only around 4% on corrections. And what happened after that is we decided that incarcerating people was more important than educating people. Today, those numbers are almost entirely reversed. The UC spends barely 3% of its revenue on the university system, the state spends barely 3% of its revenue on the university system, and almost 10%, around 9%, the number fluctuates, on the prison system. We built 22 prisons after 1980 when Reagan was president and launched the drug war, and only 1 university. $80 billion is how much we spent on incarceration in America. With that, we could afford to provide preschool to everyone, to build new roads, to do research and development, and to even eliminate tuition at every public university. That's not what we choose to invest in. Then here's another system that affects us, Wall Street, the financial crisis. Back in 2008, when recklessness, when greed, when widespread criminal activity created the financial collapse, those consequences were widely felt across the country. Already, funding for education was trending down. But after this, it trended down much more dramatically. In 2009, the state legislature cut the UC over $1 billion. In response, the UC raised its tuition by over 32%, putting it past $10,000 for the first time amidst much student outcry and protest. And the story is really the same across this country. Us as students, we contribute $3 billion to the UC's budget. The state now only contributes $2.3 billion. The state, as I mentioned, cut the UC's budget by almost 27%, and they decided to balance it on your backs. We're at the same level of funding as we were back in 1999, despite the fact that we're educating 80,000 more students. So when all this financial crisis happened, and when we saw this massive cut in education funding, we saw tuition increase. The result is, since 2008, student debt has doubled entirely, from $640 billion to $1 trillion where it stands today. That's an 800% increase since the 1980s. Our parents are still paying back their student loan debt while we are just getting into paying ours. The national debt of Greece is dwarfed by the national debt of the students in this country. And now not all of this is about state funding. Part of it is about how the UC and how universities spend their own money. I went to this meeting where the UC decided to raise its tuition on students. There were students speaking about how they could barely afford food. They wouldn't know how to pay for anything when tuition raised. The same meeting, the UC decided to raise by 20% the highest salaries of their chancellors. This is taking people who are making $400,000 a year, $500,000 a year, and adding even more to that. And across the system, we're seeing far more spent on administrative costs than ever before. So we have a lot to do. But this impact that it's having on us, all of us, of student loan debt is very deep. This is Thomas Piketty. He's a leading economist. He wrote Capital in the 21st Century. And he says that student loan debt is the #1 enemy to meritocracy. It's the #1 thing that we use to try and get forward students from lower income classes, students of color, and yet at the same time, we're really being punished for trying to achieve and do more. And he's saying that he's shocked that student loan debt is not more of a policy priority for people across this country, despite the fact that it has these long-lasting problems. It affects not just only us, where we have 40 million people paying back student loan debt trillion of that in total. It affects when we buy homes, when we get married, when people buy cars. It is an entire drag on the economy, and a drag that is disproportionately felt by people who come from lower income families and from communities of color. Top 1%, many of us know, own 35% of the wealth. And there's policies that we can use, like the Robin Hood tax, to find enough money to make education free. The Robin Hood tax, which is a 0.5% tax on Wall Street transactions, would generate over almost about $350 billion, and across this country, we spend $62 billion. Now, I didn't come here to lecture you all on policy proposals or on the finer, wonky details of some of these issues. What I am trying to get you all to understand is that the money exists, but there's a reason why we're not getting to it. There's a reason why we're paying more and more. If you look at Wall Street, which crashed the economy in 2008, they spent over $1 billion in the decade prior lobbying Congress, donating to campaigns. How can we expect the kinds of solutions that we need to see when the people we need to see held accountable are the very people who control the system? So across the world, we're seeing international movements for students fighting for affordable, free higher education. We saw earlier this year in South Africa. We've seen massive protests in Chile, where cities have been shut down, universities have been on strike for years now. So free higher education in the United States is possible. The situation we're in now is not acceptable, but it's going to take a lot more than that to win. So one thing that happened earlier this year is, almost said president, Senator Bernie Sanders, I wish, was on ABC, and he said, what's going to take for Congress and for people to really pay attention to these issues is for 1 million students to march to the Capitol and demand it. Now, this wasn't picked up very much, except by a group of students who put together what was called the 1 Million Student March, 3 central demands that we all remember: tuition-free education, cancellation of student debt, and a $15 minimum wage for campus workers. And that, at over 100 campuses across the country, we saw earlier in November, we saw widespread coverage of this. On our campus, we had the biggest march of all at 1,500 students coming together saying that we need to make this a priority and that this is important to us. A few weeks ago, at the same day, college students in Missouri, black students fed up with an immense amount of racial hostility on campus, organized, took down their chancellor. And on that very same day that we were organizing for the 1 Million Student March, the Black Liberation Collective was organizing to have hundreds of protests across the country around the issue of racism. So those two groups came together about a week ago and added a 4th demand, which was the end of university funding for private prisons. So we had that action as well here. We responded to that National Day Against Racism with some of the challenges that occurred on our campus. And there was a lot of people who worked very hard to pull that together. And the reason why this is important and why it's significant, and I'm going to end here in a moment or two, is because when students rally and when they come together and they draw the links between private prisons, which lobby for the policies that create mass incarceration, and free education, which can only be possible if education is made more of a priority than incarceration, is because what we're doing is we know we're not going to solve this by marching, but we're putting forward a different vision for how our country, for how our world can be. And we're forcing the people in power to pay attention to that and to respond to it. And I've had a lot of conversations with people who don't realize that I know what I'm talking about when they come to this. They don't know that, I've studied the history of the UC, and they come to me as if they've duped me. And they say, hey, Mohsin, you want free higher education? How are you going to pay for that? And they laugh at themselves, and they're so smug. And they think that they're really experts, that, oh, there's no way you can pay for this. Well, we've seen throughout this presentation, there is a way you can pay for this. It's very clear. Whether it's Wall Street, whether it's cutting from how much we spend on prisons. But there is a problem that maybe they're right about. Maybe we cannot afford to do what we need to do in the current system we have. What about the next system, though? Thank you.